What if one of the most important revelations in human history was witnessed by only 3 people? Not in a palace, not before a crowd, not beneath the gaze of emperors or priests, but on a lonely mountain, hidden above the dust and noise of the world. For nearly 2,000 years, scholars, theologians, historians, and skeptics have returned to the same unsettling question. What exactly happened on the mountain of the Transfiguration? According to the Gospel accounts, a traveling teacher from Galilee climbed into the wilderness with 3 of his closest followers. Moments later, his appearance changed. His face blazed with light. His garments shone with an impossible brilliance. 2 figures from Israel's distant past suddenly stood beside him. Then a voice emerged from a cloud, a voice that seemed to echo the language of Sinai itself. At first glance, the story appears straightforward. A miracle, a revelation, a glimpse of divine glory. Yet the deeper we investigate, the stranger it becomes. Why are so many details borrowed from ancient Jewish imagery? Why do Moses and Elijah appear together? Why does the event occur on a mountain? And perhaps most importantly, why does this extraordinary moment remain hidden from almost everyone else? The historical record preserves the account. The theological tradition celebrates it. But neither fully resolves the mystery. Some scholars argue that the Transfiguration preserves the memory of a real experience that transformed the disciples forever. Others remain unconvinced, suggesting that the story was crafted as a symbolic declaration about Jesus' identity. The evidence points in multiple directions. The debate remains open. And before we can decide what happened on that mountain, we must first understand why mountains themselves were considered gateways between heaven and earth in the ancient world. To understand the mystery on the mountain, we must first leave the mountain behind. We must descend into the world that produced the story itself, a world very different from the one many imagine. The land of first-century Judea was not a quiet religious province. It was a tense frontier of empire, memory, and expectation. Roman standards stood over ancient cities. Tax collectors served distant rulers. Soldiers patrolled roads that crossed landscapes once walked by prophets and kings. Yet beneath the visible power of Rome, another kingdom occupied the imagination of the people. The kingdom promised in the sacred writings of Israel. Villages scattered across rocky hillsides lived in the shadow of stories far older than any empire. Every child knew the names of Abraham, Moses, David, and Elijah. Every synagogue echoed with readings from ancient scrolls. The past was not dead. It surrounded daily life like an unseen presence. In this world, mountains carried meanings beyond geography. They were places where heaven seemed dangerously close to earth. Sinai was remembered as the mountain wrapped in cloud and fire where Moses received the law. Horeb was where Elijah encountered the divine presence not in wind, earthquake, or flame, but in a voice almost too quiet to hear. The historical record shows that sacred mountains occupied a unique place in Jewish religious imagination. They were thresholds between the human and the divine. This context matters because the story of the Transfiguration emerges from precisely this symbolic landscape. The evidence suggests that the Gospel writers expected their audience to recognize these associations immediately. Yet this raises a deeper question. If mountains were already linked to Revelation, were the Gospel authors simply using familiar imagery to communicate a theological message? Or were they preserving the memory of an event that witnesses themselves struggled to describe except through the language of ancient sacred history? Before we examine what happened on the mountain, we must first understand why the mountain itself mattered. Imagine the scene not as a passage in an ancient manuscript, but as a sacred image emerging from darkness. A mountain rises against the night sky, its rocky slopes swallowed by shadow. The air is thin. The world below has disappeared. Villages, roads, fields, and kingdoms lie hidden beneath a sea of darkness. Only the summit remains visible, suspended between earth and heaven. At the center stands a solitary figure. Then something changes, not around him, but within him. Light begins to emerge from where light should not exist. It does not descend from the heavens. It radiates outward from the man himself. His face becomes impossible to behold, blazing with the intensity of the rising sun. His garments shimmer with a whiteness beyond cloth, beyond stone, beyond anything found in the natural world. Ancient writers struggle for language. They reach for comparisons to sunlight, to lightning, to the brilliance of heavenly beings, yet every description feels inadequate. Beside him appear two other figures, half veiled by luminous mist. One carries the silent authority of Sinai, the mountain where fire once covered the summit and a nation trembled below. The other bears the austere presence of the wilderness prophet who vanished into heaven in a whirlwind. Gold and white merge with deep blue shadows. The scene feels less like a moment in history and more like a sacred icon come alive. Then comes the cloud. Not a storm cloud, not a drifting veil of vapor. This cloud glows from within. It moves with intention. It surrounds the mountain summit like a living sanctuary, transforming the barren peak into a cosmic temple. In ancient Jewish imagination, clouds marked the boundary where mortal vision failed and divine presence began. The mountain becomes architecture without stone, a sanctuary without walls, a throne room without a throne. And standing at its center is the figure whose identity forms the heart of our investigation. The image is beautiful. It is unsettling. And for many scholars, every detail within it functions as a symbol waiting to be decoded. The deeper we investigate the Transfiguration, the more we discover that the mountain is not only a place of revelation. It is a battlefield of interpretation. The conflict begins with a fundamental historical question. What kind of event are we dealing with? The Gospel accounts present the scene as something witnessed by Peter, James, and John. The language suggests observation. They see, they hear, they react with fear. Yet many scholars note that the event unfolds in a manner remarkably similar to visionary experiences found throughout ancient religious literature. This creates the first tension. Was the Transfiguration a historical occurrence experienced by real witnesses, or was it a theological vision later expressed through narrative form? The evidence allows both possibilities to remain on the table. A second conflict emerges from the identity of Jesus himself. Within the story, Moses and Elijah appear beside him. For many early Christians, this scene demonstrated that Jesus stood above the law and the prophets. Yet from another perspective, the imagery is so carefully constructed that some scholars argue it functions primarily as theological symbolism. The difficulty with that interpretation is that symbolic narratives do not necessarily exclude historical memories. Ancient authors often used symbolism precisely because they believed an event carried extraordinary meaning. Then there is the conflict between ancient faith and modern historical method. The historical record preserves the account in multiple gospel traditions. This strengthens its significance within early Christianity. Yet historians cannot independently verify supernatural claims. Archaeology can investigate mountains. Textual criticism can analyze manuscripts. Neither can directly measure divine glory. This limitation creates a boundary that scholarship cannot fully cross. Some scholars argue that the Transfiguration reflects an authentic experience that convinced the disciples they had glimpsed Jesus' true identity. Others remain unconvinced, suggesting the story developed as a post-resurrection interpretation projected backward into Jesus' ministry. Both positions contain strengths. Both face difficulties. And as we weigh these competing explanations, a deeper question begins to emerge. If the story was preserved so carefully by the earliest Christian communities, what exactly did they believe was being revealed on that mountain? When we move beyond the familiar gospel narrative and begin examining the wider textual landscape, unexpected details start to emerge from the shadows. The Transfiguration is often treated as a self-contained event, yet several ancient traditions appear to orbit around it like fragments of a larger puzzle. One of the most intriguing clues appears in the second letter of Peter. There, the author refers to eyewitnesses who saw Jesus receive honor and glory on the holy mountain. Some scholars view this as an independent memory of the Transfiguration tradition. Others question whether the text was written later and reflects an already developed theological interpretation. The evidence remains debated. Another mystery concerns the appearance of Moses and Elijah themselves. The canonical Gospels never explain how the disciples recognized them. No introduction is recorded. No identification is given. Ancient commentators proposed various explanations. Some suggested supernatural revelation. Others argued that the conversation itself revealed their identities. The text offers no definitive answer. Then there are traditions outside the New Testament. Certain early Christian writers connected the Transfiguration to Jewish apocalyptic literature, where righteous figures are transformed by divine light. In texts such as 1 Enoch and other Second Temple writings, heavenly glory is often described not merely as illumination, but as participation in a higher reality. Some scholars argue that the Gospel authors were drawing upon these traditions. Others caution that the parallels may be broader cultural patterns rather than direct literary dependence. Perhaps the most fascinating detail lies in Luke's account. Unlike Matthew and Mark, Luke notes that Moses and Elijah were discussing Jesus' coming departure in Jerusalem. The Greek term used is exodos. It is an unusual choice. For some scholars, this evokes the exodus of Moses and suggests a deeper theological connection between liberation, covenant, and the destiny of Jesus. Others remain unconvinced, arguing that the language may simply refer to death. The difficulty is that ancient texts rarely explain their symbols. They expect readers to recognize them. And so the deeper we explore the hidden layers of the tradition, the more we encounter possibilities rather than certainties, echoes rather than answers, and clues that seem deliberately left unfinished. If we treat the Transfiguration merely as a miracle story, many of its details appear mysterious. If we approach it as a symbolic text rooted in the intellectual world of ancient Judaism, those same details begin to reveal a deeper structure. Let us start with the mountain itself. Across the ancient Near East, mountains frequently functioned as sacred spaces. Archaeology reveals that temples were often built on elevated ground, while ancient literature repeatedly portrays high places as meeting points between heaven and earth. The mountain in the Transfiguration is therefore not simply a location. It is a symbol of revelation. Next comes the light. Modern readers often interpret light as a sign of supernatural power, but in biblical and Second Temple literature, light more often signifies divine presence, wisdom, holiness, or heavenly status. The evidence suggests that luminosity served as a visual language through which ancient authors described encounters with the sacred. Then we encounter Moses and Elijah. Historically, they represent two of the most influential figures in Israel's memory. Symbolically, they represent something larger. Moses embodies the law. Elijah embodies the prophets. Their appearance beside Jesus creates a literary image in which the foundational traditions of Israel converge at a single point. The cloud introduces another layer. Archaeological evidence cannot investigate a sacred cloud, but textual evidence can. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, clouds repeatedly mark moments when the divine becomes present yet remains partially concealed. The cloud reveals and hides simultaneously. It allows proximity while preserving mystery. Even Peter's desire to build 3 shelters carries symbolic weight. Some scholars connect this to the Feast of Tabernacles, a festival associated with divine presence and future redemption. Others remain cautious, noting that the text never explicitly confirms such a connection. The strongest evidence suggests that every major element in the narrative functions on multiple levels at once: historical memory, theological expression, and symbolic communication. The Transfiguration is not merely describing what happened. It is also attempting to explain what the event meant. And in ancient literature, meaning was often conveyed through symbols more powerfully than through direct explanation. Every enduring mystery eventually generates interpretations that stand outside the mainstream. The Transfiguration is no exception. Throughout history, a number of scholars, theologians, and religious movements have proposed readings that were controversial, rejected, or simply overshadowed by more dominant traditions. One of the earliest alternative interpretations emerged from groups sometimes associated with adoptionist thought. Rather than viewing the Transfiguration as a revelation of an eternal divine nature, they suggested it marked a moment of special exaltation, a public affirmation of Jesus' unique status before his death. Mainstream Christian theology ultimately rejected this reading, yet it reveals how differently the same text could be understood in the first centuries. Another controversial proposal appears in modern historical scholarship. Some researchers have argued that the Transfiguration may originally have been a post-resurrection appearance tradition that was later placed within Jesus' earthly ministry. The reasoning is understandable. Several elements resemble resurrection narratives: radiant glory, fear among witnesses, and a revelation of identity. Others remain unconvinced. The difficulty with this interpretation is that the Transfiguration also contains distinctive features deeply rooted in pre-resurrection themes and Jewish prophetic symbolism. Then there is the visionary hypothesis. Certain scholars suggest the disciples experienced an altered state of perception, perhaps during prayer, exhaustion, or intense religious expectation. In this reading, the event was real to the witnesses, but not necessarily physical in the ordinary sense. Critics argue that such explanations often rely on modern psychological categories that may not accurately reflect ancient understandings of visionary experience. More esoteric interpretations have occasionally appeared as well. Some mystical traditions viewed the Transfiguration as evidence that human beings possess a hidden capacity to participate in divine light. While these ideas influenced later spirituality, historians generally distinguish such theological reflections from what can be established through textual evidence. What makes these interpretations fascinating is not whether they are correct. It is that each attempts to solve the same puzzle from a different angle. The historical record preserves the event. The symbols suggest multiple layers of meaning. The evidence supports certain conclusions more strongly than others. Yet the debate remains open. And perhaps that openness is precisely why the Transfiguration continues to provoke inquiry rather than silence. At this stage of our investigation, two major theories emerge from the evidence, and the tension between them has shaped scholarly debate for generations. The first theory may be called the historical revelation model. According to this interpretation, the Transfiguration preserves the memory of an actual event experienced by Peter, James, and John. The evidence supporting this view begins with the multiple gospel accounts and the apparent eyewitness character of the narrative. The disciples react with confusion, fear, and incomprehension rather than certainty. Such details often resemble remembered experiences more than carefully constructed theological arguments. Supporters also point to the reference in 2 Peter, where the event is recalled as something witnessed on a holy mountain. In this reading, the symbolic elements do not diminish the event's historical reality. They are the language available to ancient witnesses attempting to describe something extraordinary. The opposing theory is often called the visionary narrative model. Here, the focus shifts from what happened on the mountain to how early Christians understood Jesus after the resurrection. Some scholars argue that the Transfiguration functions primarily as a theological proclamation embedded within narrative form. The appearance of Moses and Elijah, the luminous cloud, the heavenly voice, and the mountain setting all echo earlier biblical patterns with remarkable precision. The difficulty for proponents of the historical model, critics argue, is explaining why the account appears so carefully shaped by established sacred symbolism. Yet the visionary theory faces its own challenge. Symbolic construction does not necessarily imply historical invention. Ancient writers frequently interpreted real events through theological imagery. The strongest evidence, therefore, does not completely eliminate either position. Instead, it reveals a complex overlap between memory, interpretation, and meaning. Perhaps the Transfiguration was a historical experience expressed through symbolic language. Perhaps it was a symbolic narrative rooted in profound religious conviction. The archaeological record cannot settle the matter. The texts themselves remain our primary witnesses. And as we stand between these competing explanations, one question continues to linger. If the earliest followers of Jesus believed this story was worth preserving, what did they think had been revealed that was so important it could not be forgotten? Unlike some events described in ancient history, the Transfiguration leaves behind no inscription carved into stone, no royal decree, no surviving monument announcing that such a moment occurred. The archaeological record cannot confirm that a radiant transformation took place on a mountain in 1st century Judea. Yet archaeology does preserve the world in which the story emerged, and those echoes are often more revealing than they first appear. The first question concerns the mountain itself. For centuries, Christian tradition identified Mount Tabor as the site of the Transfiguration. Pilgrims traveled there, churches were constructed there, and the location became embedded within sacred memory. However, archaeological investigations suggest that Tabor was not as isolated during the 1st century as later tradition sometimes assumed. This has led some scholars to consider Mount Hermon as an alternative candidate, particularly because of its proximity to Caesarea Philippi in the Gospel narrative. The archaeological record, however, cannot decisively identify either location. What survives is possibility rather than certainty. Beyond geography, there are textual artifacts that illuminate the story's symbolic world. The Dead Sea Scrolls reveal that many Jewish groups during the Second Temple period were deeply interested in divine glory, heavenly beings, sacred mountains, and transformative encounters with God. These manuscripts do not mention the Transfiguration directly, yet they demonstrate that the language of light and revelation found in the Gospels did not emerge in isolation. Similar themes already circulated within Jewish religious thought. Ancient synagogue mosaics and early Christian artworks provide another echo. By the Byzantine period, images of the Transfiguration consistently portrayed Christ at the center, surrounded by radiant light and flanked by Moses and Elijah. These visual traditions are not evidence for the event itself. They are evidence for how generations interpreted its meaning. The strongest archaeological evidence, therefore, is indirect. It does not prove the Transfiguration happened. It reveals the cultural and religious landscape that made such a narrative intelligible. The stones remain silent. The manuscripts speak only in fragments. Yet together they preserve a memory world in which mountains, clouds, light, and revelation formed a language that ancient audiences immediately understood. To modern readers, the Transfiguration is often approached as a question of whether a miracle happened. To an ancient audience, the more important question may have been what the event revealed about the structure of reality itself. The theological significance of the story begins with a worldview very different from modern assumptions. In the Jewish imagination of the Second Temple period, heaven and earth were not completely separate realms. They overlapped. At certain moments, in certain places, the veil between them could become thin. Sacred mountains, holy temples, prophetic visions, and divine encounters were all understood as points where ordinary reality intersected with a greater unseen order. Within this framework, the Transfiguration is not merely about physical transformation. It is about revelation. The Greek term behind the idea of glory carried meanings far beyond brightness. Glory signified divine presence, authority, honor, and participation in the reality of God. When ancient readers encountered descriptions of radiant figures, they often understood them as signs that hidden truths were becoming visible. Moses had encountered divine glory on Sinai. Elijah had experienced the divine presence on Horeb. The appearance of both figures alongside Jesus therefore communicated something profound to an ancient audience. The narrative places Jesus within the continuum of Israel's sacred history, while simultaneously presenting him as its focal point. The heavenly voice reinforces this theme. In ancient religious thought, voices from heaven were not casual occurrences. They functioned as divine authorization, publicly identifying a figure's role within the unfolding purposes of God. Yet the theological significance extends even deeper. The story suggests that reality contains dimensions not normally perceived by human senses. What appears ordinary may conceal something extraordinary. For ancient believers, this was not simply a statement about Jesus. It reflected a broader understanding of the cosmos itself. The visible world was never considered the whole story. Whether one interprets the Transfiguration historically, symbolically, or theologically, its deepest significance lies in the unveiling of what had previously remained hidden. Not the creation of a new reality, but the temporary disclosure of one that, according to the worldview of the time, had always been there. Beneath the historical debates, the symbolic language, and the theological interpretations lies a question older than any manuscript. Why were human beings so fascinated by moments when the boundary between the visible and the invisible appeared to dissolve? The Transfiguration belongs to a larger pattern found throughout the ancient world. Again and again, civilizations imagined mountains, temples, visions, and sacred encounters as places where ordinary perception failed and a deeper reality became visible. This fascination was not merely religious curiosity. It emerged from a profound awareness of human limitation. Ancient people lived beneath vast skies, surrounded by forces they could not control and mysteries they could not fully explain. Birth arrived from hidden places. Death carried people into unseen realms. Dreams seemed to open doors into worlds beyond waking life. The human condition itself appeared suspended between knowledge and ignorance. Within this context, stories such as the Transfiguration become more than accounts of extraordinary events. They become reflections on the limits of perception. The disciples ascend the mountain believing they understand the man they follow. Yet for a brief moment, they encounter something that exceeds their categories. Their response is not certainty. It is bewilderment, fear, silence. The ancient record repeatedly portrays encounters with the sacred in this way. Revelation does not remove mystery. It often deepens it. This raises a philosophical tension that runs through much of ancient thought. Human beings long to know what lies beyond the horizon of ordinary experience. Yet whenever they approach that horizon, language begins to fail. Symbols replace descriptions. Visions replace explanations. Poetry replaces certainty. Perhaps this is why the Transfiguration remains so compelling within religious memory. Not because it solved the mystery of existence, but because it dramatized the encounter between finite minds and realities believed to transcend them. In the end, the mountain may symbolize something larger than a specific location in Judea. It may represent the perennial human ascent toward understanding itself. A journey driven by the hope that beyond the limits of sight and knowledge there exists a truth waiting to be revealed, and by the equally unsettling possibility that such truth can never be fully grasped by those who seek it. After following the evidence through history, theology, symbolism, archaeology, and philosophy, we arrive at the point where every serious investigation must eventually pause and ask a final question. What is the most convincing reading of the Transfiguration? The historical record confirms that the story occupied an important place within the memory of the earliest Christian communities. The textual evidence suggests that the tradition was preserved across multiple sources. The symbolic structure reveals deep roots in Jewish religious imagination. Moses, Elijah, the mountain, the cloud, the heavenly voice, and the radiant glory are not random details. They form a coherent language understood by the world that produced the narrative. Yet symbolism alone cannot explain why the story was remembered with such persistence. At the same time, historical analysis cannot demonstrate with certainty that every element unfolded exactly as described. The evidence points toward a reality more complex than either extreme position often allows. My reading of the evidence is that the Transfiguration is best understood as a profound revelatory tradition preserved through the symbolic vocabulary of ancient Judaism. Whether the event originated as a historical experience, a visionary encounter, or something that transcends those modern categories remains difficult to determine. The strongest evidence does not eliminate mystery. It defines its boundaries. What appears most significant is not the transformation itself, but the narrative's central claim about identity. Throughout the investigation, every symbol has pointed toward the same destination. The mountain points there. Moses and Elijah point there. The cloud points there. Even the voice from heaven points there. The story is constructed around the unveiling of a figure whose true nature is presented as greater than ordinary perception can grasp. In this sense, the Transfiguration is less concerned with changing Jesus than with changing the vision of those who witness him. The event functions as an unveiling, a moment in which hidden meaning becomes briefly visible before disappearing once more into mystery. And perhaps that is why the account has endured for centuries. Not because it resolves every question, but because it stands at the threshold where history, faith, memory, and interpretation meet, and where certainty gives way to contemplation. Our investigation began with a simple question. What happened on a mountain somewhere in ancient Judea? Yet the farther we traveled through the evidence, the less the story seemed confined to a single place or moment in history. We examined texts preserved for centuries. We followed traces through sacred symbolism, theological reflection, archaeological echoes, and competing scholarly theories. We weighed arguments, considered objections, and explored possibilities. And yet, standing at the end of this journey, the mountain remains partially hidden in the mist. Perhaps that should not surprise us. The most enduring mysteries of the ancient world rarely survive because they are fully understood. They survive because each generation discovers something new within them. The Transfiguration remains one of those mysteries. Historians continue to debate its origins. Theologians continue to debate its meaning. Scholars continue to debate how memory, symbolism, and historical experience intertwine within the narrative. The evidence illuminates much, but not everything. The silence that remains may be as important as the answers we have found. If the earliest witnesses truly believe they encountered a revelation on that mountain, what was it that changed them so profoundly that the memory endured long after empires rose and fell? If the story is shaped through the language of sacred symbolism, why did those symbols become so powerful that they continued to resonate across centuries and civilizations? And if the purpose of the narrative was not merely to reveal something about Jesus, but also to reveal something about the limits of human perception, have we fully understood its deepest message? These questions remain open. They belong not only to theologians and historians, but to every reader willing to enter the ancient conversation. To the scholars, researchers, and thoughtful minds who have joined this journey through forgotten scriptures, your insights, disagreements, and perspectives remain part of the investigation itself. Every interpretation adds another layer to a mystery that no single voice can completely resolve. The mountain still stands. The cloud has not entirely lifted. And somewhere between history and meaning, the question that first drew us here continues to wait for an answer.